Well, it's after 7 and we actually have a quorum. So I'm going to call us to order so we can progress. The first item on the agenda is the executive session minutes. Can I have a motion?
Jim?
Yes.
I believe the first item on the agenda is the vote.
Budget, yes, you're right. My vision must be going Wendy off so she can have an evening. So this is the budget article that we tabled last meeting, and I'd like a motion to move it to the town warrant, please.
Move it to the, I'm sorry.
Town warrant.
Right. At the last meeting, the committee had questions about why the Affordable Housing Trust ask was within the budget article, and also wanted to know why the open space reserves weren't specifically called out. So we asked Wendy to be here tonight to explain those two things.
Right, and I would like a motion, move it to the article so we can discuss it.
Okay, all right.
So move.
Second. Great.
Each second.
Thank you. I saw Greg's lips moving, but nothing was happening. So, okay. Thank you. Now, do we have questions for Wendy? And she kindly is with us.
Well, I think we have the questions left over from the last meeting. Let's get those answered first.
Okay.
Yeah, so at the last meeting, it came up that the Affordable Housing Trust transfer was not in a separate article. And in a lot of years past, we have done it that way, but actually last year, we did include it as part of the budget article. And where it is a recurring annual transfer, it does make sense to take it out of the estimated revenues for the upcoming year. And if it's going to be the amount of the like the minimum transfer, then it makes sense to just have it as part of the budget.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see the budget article? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let me just explain. So if you add up all of these items that are here, they add up to $1,775,000, and that's basically the estimated revenues for fiscal 22. So your admin budget would be 5% of that, and then your reserves would be at a minimum for the 10%, 177,500. So that's where some of those amounts come from. So that's where the administrative expense amount comes from. The debt service is the amount of the debt service that we have on the books. And the debt service meets your open space spending requirement. So you have to either reserve or spend 10% of your estimated budget. And because your debt service meets that spending, you're not required to reserve another $177,500 the way you are for historic resources, say. Because there are no proposed historic resource spending or separate projects. So you've got the debt service, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that would be the annual transfer, and that's in the appropriations section versus the reserves because it's an amount specifically for that trust of the $177,500. As I said, there's no historic reserve spending. So proposed, so that would be a reserve of $177,500, and then the difference is the annual budgeted reserve, and that's there to give you flexibility during the year. If some project came up, that you would be able to appropriate from your estimated revenues once we set the tax rate. Any other questions?
I want to say, I think another question that arose was whether the administrative expenses rolled over year to year if they're not used in a current year, Wendy?
They do not roll over, no. So those would be closed into the unreserved fund balance. So one thing that does not show here is your unreserved fund balance. So after the November special town meeting, there were a few appropriations made from the fund balance then. The balance now is $4,947,681. So you potentially have that to spend. Basically, your available, funding sources are going to be that fund balance plus your annual budgeted reserve. So it's 4.9 million. That's going to go up at the end of this fiscal year when we close everything out because your appropriations this particular fiscal year are very much.
And so just to be clear, Wendy, the administrative expenses don't roll over year to year into administrative expenses and continue to build, but they are rolled into the unreserved. Did I hear that correctly?
Right. It just closes, that appropriation will lapse at the end of the fiscal year if you don't spend it.
Right, but it doesn't, they don't, we don't lose that money. That money's not.
Right. No, you don't lose it, no.
Wendy, I think Ed had a question. I don't want to ask him. Please object if this is incorrect, Ed, but the affordable housing allocation is to affordable housing, not to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's more generalized than just the trust fund, I believe.
No, because this amount actually, it gets transferred into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And from there, the board will decide on how they want to allocate it. We do separate, when we keep track of the Affordable Housing Trust balance on the books, we keep track of sort of like the CPA portion and the non-CPA portion, but it does go into the trust.
I didn't know that.
So if I could just ask, so when, I was always under the impression, because it's neighborhood housing in the CPA Act, and you're saying it, I wasn't under the impression that it's automatically earmarked for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
That's where it has gone historically. Unless you have a particular project, because I think in the past you voted some particular projects that might qualify under community housing, but this particular amount that gets voted, just like last year, it goes into the Affordable Housing Trust.
And if I could interject, the CPC had discussed at previous meetings that because this year isn't really doing CPA applications, but the Affordable Housing Trust does rely on at least the minimum 10% for community housing, that the trust ask for this year would be that 10% set aside. And so that's what this represents.
Right, but that's not part of the CPA Act, right? It's community housing. So in theory, and again, I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not opposed to the Affordable Housing Trust getting this money, but in years past, now maybe the accounting's been done differently, but we're not really involved in that. We're not privy to that. But we've always voted up or down on what we were funding the Affordable Housing Trust. They don't automatically get 10%. 10% goes to community housing, which we have historically, right, we have funded Affordable Housing Trust, but we're not required to do that. And I just think we need to, I mean, am I wrong there? Or is that
No, you're not correct on that. Yeah, there's not a requirement that whatever you appropriate for community housing goes to the trust fund.
Right, and and I wouldn't think it would because some communities might not have an affordable housing trust.
Yeah, I just don't want to, I think that's an important step that this board votes where our community housing, if any, money goes in a certain year. I just didn't want to get overruled by an accounting. I want to make sure we don't lose our right to vote on it. That's what I'm saying.
That's a very good point.
Other questions for Wendy? Hearing none, can we vote on this article then? For this, moving this forward to the warrant?
I think the vote at this point would be recommended, that the CPC recommends the article.
Okay. I'll take a vote then. Lee, aye.
Will you call on people individually? Would that be a little more efficient, Jim? You just call them?
Okay. I will do that. I think that was Sheedy, so,
It was, yeah.
Strange,
Range I.
Amanda,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Meredith,
Aye.
is anyone else out there?
Carol, Lundin, aye.
Excellent, thank you. I'll have a list on my screen, so I didn't know who was up. Thank you.
Beg your pardon, Mr. Chairman. Who made the motion and who seconded it?
I made
Hans
the
and
motion.
Varela.
Sorry, what did you say?
Hans motioned and Varela seconded.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're moving to the letters of interest.
Wendy, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, support.
Thank you.
Aye.
And we'll start with, as on the agenda, Oak State Memorial Hall. So we wanted to discuss this and consider a timeline review. I'll start. One of the things that I guess somewhat surprised me, and maybe it's my ignorance, is that this is for interior work on the hall, not exterior protection. I understand that the elevator is part of this, right? Something we had an interest in. Is that surprising to anyone else?
Well, they had to finally fix the,
trigger.
you know. They spent so much money on the outside, it had to be fixed sometime, so.
Well, wasn't this, if I recall, this because of the amount of money that has been spent as a percentage of the value of the structure? It is basically any further substantial work is going to kick it into needing to get into compliance. I think that's what
architectural access board driven.
Right, and I think, you know, when we get, I mean, you know, I've advocated for a while, let's get this all done as fast as we can, because prices are only going up and up and up, something specialized like this. At the same time, I think there's a bigger question for the community. I think we should do this as part of a, whether it's this year or up the road, I think we should do this part of omnibus funding and include development of a parking lot out back, because to make this a truly viable facility of whatever type, you know, it needs that parking out back, and that also ties into unifying the campus with the library and helping with economic development downtown. And I think that's the mistake we made a few years ago. We were juggling a bunch of items, and we ran out of time to build consensus, and we should have pulled it. And we said, oh, let's go for it, and then didn't. So you know, anyways, I just think, you know, that's the approach. I think that's wise for the community. I think it'll give us the most bang for the buck and be the best use of our money.
Wasn't that voted down at town meeting?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
That doesn't mean it can't be brought back up again.
No.
And I think at the time, everybody, including the abutters, felt that it just happened too quickly and people hadn't had a chance to really analyze it. So,
Yeah, we broke the golden rule. We didn't do outreach because we ran out of time. And, but I personally, to me, that doesn't make it any less. I think it's a very important and needed project. I think it's a missing piece of a puzzle. And if we're going to drop, when you really go back and look at the master plan for the hall, the price tag is much higher than 3 million. And I suspect post-COVID, it'll be even higher. And I don't suspect that the town is going to let that building fall into disrepair. So if we're going to have to spend such a large chunk, we need to put it in a, we need to position that building where to get some of the money back, and parking is an essential part of it.
Well, parking will move it way beyond what the request was, correct?
Oh, I don't know if I'd say way. No, not. I mean, it would be substantially less than what they're requesting now, the parking version.
the question though, is, and I think Amanda, mentioned it, are we at the point where ADA, accountability has kicked in? Do we have to do this next with the elevator, or can we postpone that a year and do the parking lot?
The threshold is so low, I can't imagine. I'm shocked it hasn't kicked in already with all the work that's been done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think the unique and historical nature of that structure has probably helped a little bit on the state level, and the fact that it's, it isn't, the building's not used that much. So, and I don't know. I'm not an expert. I wouldn't know whether doing the parking lot. To me, they go hand in hand. I would do it all at once. It seems to me just to drop 4 or 5 million for an elevator and the remainder of the exterior improvements as called out in the master plan, and some of the things that are on the interior that would need to be done. If we're going to, it's probably, I think it's going to be 5 million, and I think you need a parking lot to make that a viable building. Otherwise, it'll just continue to be a white elephant. And if we're going to drop such a substantial chunk of money, doesn't it make sense to give it an opportunity to thrive as some use?
Oh, I'm not questioning your argument, Greg. I think it's a good one. I'm just questioning, first of all, do we want to expend all that money in a single year or over the course of 2 years? And if we had to choose between the elevator and the parking lot, I kind of agree with you that the parking lot has the priority.
I had these misgivings before, and I still have them. I have major concerns about whether a parking lot should be a permitted use of CPA funds. I mean, we're using it to address a long-term need of the town, which and we've done it again with town hall this past year, but I would put a much higher priority on actual repairs and accessibility than economic viability.
And so Amanda, just to respond to the question of whether it can be, CPA funds can be used for the parking lot, the opinion was, and of council and also of the coalition was, if it's done in conjunction with the restoration and making the facility part of the programming, in the historic nature of the programming, then you certainly could consider it. Doing it as a standalone is a little trickier.
I know, I remember the opinion, and I remember not being horribly persuaded by it.
Yep.
I would just point out some basic engineering and architectural facts. As if you're familiar with the property, it has a very small parking lot right now, and it's kind of wink, wink. There's 12 spaces out there, but they don't meet any of our bylaws. Now that elevator is going on the outside of the building, so once that structure is built, it's darn near impossible to get any handicap spaces out there. which would be a complete violation. So it's a conundrum, but it's, you know, and we can disagree, but I look at that. For years, we've talked about, the Historical Commission and the Historical Society have talked about how historical can tie into economic development, architectural groups, school groups, all of the people that come to look at the largest collection of Richardson buildings in a single municipality, et cetera, et cetera. And the beautiful work that's been done at the library and that campus, unifying both of those, can really position this town to take advantage of its historical resources.
Well, from what Stephanie said, it seems that it would be appropriate to move the whole project forward, including expanded parking. And this discussion really is part of a give and take with those proposing this budget item. It's a dialogue. So in that sense, can we make a recommendation back to the board of the hall to include parking in this proposal?
Can I jump in? It's Meredith, sorry. I'll be able to put my video on in a minute. I
Go
just
for it.
want to just remind everyone, at the town meeting, I remember the abutters being absolutely apoplectic over the prospect of a parking lot. And it's, I understand that in order for the building to be viable, parking is absolutely needed. I mean, it's a hall, right? So people are going to be there, but for a very long time, people have lived there, quiet, peaceful enjoyment of their own property, and to find out that a parking lot, and we know that there's ledge there, or believed to be ledge, it would not be an easy parking lot to build, and it could really negatively impact those abutters. For what use? I don't know, and I think it's important for us to be very mindful of those people who live right there and really take careful consideration for the neighbors of this property.
If I may, I would say, first of all, preliminary surveys and engineering of that, I disagree. It's not a, given the topography, it's not a difficult parking lot to construct. And it will be substantially lower than the abutting properties. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, people, I've been on planning board for 16 years. Nobody likes anything that happens next to their house. It just doesn't. It's not an Easton thing. It's not a New England thing. Maybe it's an American thing. I don't know. But when of course, when our houses were built, natural resources were affected. No trees were cut. No animals had to move. But the next thing that happened is the end of the world. And we don't need to decide that here. That's kind of outside of our purview. But people have a responsibility when they purchase a property. I live next to power lines. I did all sorts of research on that. So, wow, what's that about? And every year I watch them go by with those insecticides and herbicides, and I watch everything die. And I'm like, but you know what? I knew what I was getting into. And so, if I abut property that abuts municipal land, when there's been talk of this for years, again, I'm not saying they have to accept it. I'm not saying they don't have a right to protest or bring their point of view up. But we are a town of 25,000, not a town of 12, is all I would say.
I think part of the reason that people were so apoplectic was that it almost seemed to many of them to come by surprise. And maybe if we do a better job of laying the groundwork and showing them the plans, that people would be more likely to go along with it.
Yeah, and I mean, Greg
I
started
agree.
the conversation by acknowledging that outreach didn't happen.
Well,
So, Jim, you're suggesting that we kick this back to the hall board and ask them to include the money for the parking lot in their request?
or at least the parking lot design. The proposal that was voted down at town meeting was really, the engineering work to look at what it would take to make this happen, doing some drilling, doing some testing, at least that far.
Well,
Good. Go ahead, Ed.
I feel comfortable making that motion rather than going full hog and recommending the parking lot immediately. It's
Yeah,
all-
we can't ask for, we don't know how much it's going to cost. That's why we need to go in. I think our request at the time was 125.
Yeah, yeah, around in there.
It was gonna include geotechnical work, so there is ledge there. What's the extent of it that will affect basically the engineering of the drainage? And have the system designed once, just like they did for the building, right? Once the lot was designed, then a construction price, then it can go out to bid, estimates can be done.
Mhm.
Anyone not comfortable with that? Okay.
And just, if I could, just since it's here, I've had a few talks with some of the leaders in town about this, because I really wanted to get going on it this year, and so don't forget, we're talking about CPA for next year. I anticipate there would be, if we do go forward with this, there'll be a series of public meetings with the neighbors and with the town in general, in one form or another, depending on COVID. But there will be no shortage of outreach this time.
Okay.
And if I could maybe interject with a bit of a process overview. So under the new application concept is this letter of interest from prospective applicants. The CPC considers them, then the first step, if they seem like projects that may be of interest, they then would vote to invite a preliminary application from the prospective applicants, and then the prospective applicants would work with staff and receive feedback from the CPC over the summer, come in with a fairly well-developed preliminary application in fall, get very detailed feedback and guidance, and assuming it went well, would be invited to submit a full application for consideration at the end of the calendar year. So that's I think the action item for the letters of interest for the group for tonight's meeting is whether or not to invite a preliminary application.
Right, which I think was assumed in all the conversation we just had.
Right.
But we should be explicit about it, that we intend to move forward with this letter of interest. Is that correct?
I think the way it might work out, and Stephanie might have some better guidance on this, a motion and a second to invite Oaks Ames Memorial Hall to submit a preliminary application.
Including the recommendation to add the design for the parking lot.
Yeah, something like that.
Could I have someone move that, please?
Well, before I do that, I have a question for Greg and everyone. So the parking lot and the elevator, but there's in the master plan for the building, there's additional work for the inside. Are you comfortable, Greg, with putting that aside until these other two issues are taken care of, or do you want them to roll the whole thing up into a big ball?
You know what I've been saying for you? I'd say do the whole thing now. It's going to save us a couple million over time. I mean, when was that master plan done? It was done 6 years ago. But that's just me. Once we see what some real numbers are, I think we should take a look at it, investigate it, because prices don't go down; they just get higher. And that work has to be done. I refuse to believe that the town of Easton is going to let that building fall into disrepair, and we are going to be under the gun by the state for the ADA. And so I think we should look at trying to do the whole thing, because I just think it'll save us money in the long run. But if we can't do it, then we could always phase it out, break it up.
So I'll make a motion to have, Oaks Ames Memorial Hall submit a comprehensive proposal that includes the, elevator and the parking lot, with consideration of any other, needs to complete the project.
Is that a motion?
It was.
Second. Sorry, you caught me daydreaming.
I have that effect on people.
Further conversation? Anybody want to concern, question, amend? If not, I'll move to a vote. Lee, aye. Greg,
Strange eye.
Amanda,
Marilla, I.
Ed,
Hands eye.
yeah,
Sheedy, aye.
Carol,
Lundin, aye.
Meredith,
Each no.
thank you. Now we move to the Affordable Housing Trust request. And I'm going to take the instant break because I want to turn my light on.
Wayne, do I need to ship that? Okay.
Or yeah, you can show that if you like. So as the letter of interest mentions, the Affordable Housing Trust is doing several things this calendar year. One of them is producing the town's state required 5-year housing production plan. The current one, which we use to keep compliant with the state's 40B requirements, that expires January 30 of 2022. So we want to get the new one drafted and approved by the town and the state by that deadline. As part of that work, we're also looking to do a separate standalone 5-year action plan. Some of the older members of the CPC may remember the Affordable Housing Trust had one several years ago and based its annual asks on that 5-year action plan, on the projects and the funding. So we look to do that again this year. And then base the annual CPA requests off of that action plan. So the 250,000 in this letter of interest is essentially a placeholder. The previous years, that was roughly the ballpark that the annual asks were. And as an example of projects and programs that the trust has done, I've included this calendar year's annual report of all the things the trust has accomplished in 2020, noting that almost all of those projects were multi-year projects. Things do take a while to come to fruition. So, over the course of the spring and summer, the trust would, work with consultant to do the housing production plan, to do an allied action plan, from which would be a more detailed CPA funding application towards the end of this calendar year for consideration at the May 2022 annual town meeting.
And I just noticed, did we lose Greg?
Yes, he just texted me and he's trying to get back on.
Okay,
Oh,
I
wow.
was just going to send him a text, okay.
So parallel with our previous request, could I have a motion to include this also in the next year? This would be to.
A motion to invite a preliminary
Invite.
application.
Right, yes.
So moved.
Thank you.
The second was from whom? Was that Carol?
I don't think anyone seconded it. I
Oh,
think.
second.
Thank you.
Okay.
Who was our second?
Greg
It was
Strange,
Greg.
who was just
Thank you, welcome
obviously
back.
attacked by an IT abutter to the hall.
Oh, is that what it? Wondered what happened to you.
Okay. So discussion. Any concerns about this? Hearing none. Are you comfortable moving to a vote? Hearing none. Lee, aye. And Dennis,
Aye.
Greg,
Aye.
Amanda,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Carol,
Blondine, aye.
anyone else?
Keach, aye.
Keach, aye, thank you. Okay. It's
Thank you,
a
everybody.
handicap when we're on this small screen where I can't see everyone. Okay. So now we're at the acceptance of minutes. I just was ahead of myself, what can I say? And we're looking at the executive session minutes of February 11th.
Are they gonna be released?
Well,
So the process, Wayne and I checked on this. The process is that you can accept them first. It would be, and,
Discussion?
well, discussion would be limited if the purpose for which the committee went into executive session still exists, which presumably at this point it still does.
yes,
So if no one has any comments or changes, the committee could vote to accept, and then you would vote whether the minutes should be released or not.
okay,
And then, so if I understand, the concept would be that folks could consider to accept executive session minutes reasonably close in time to the actual meeting, so it would be fresh in people's heads. And then, what is it, Stephanie? Then they'd vote to release them, and presumably in this case, because the purpose still obtains, the vote would be no. And then
Correct,
it would just ride along until the business was done in some
right.
future month.
right.
But you would have accepted minutes that had been fresh in your head.
Right, and the committee will recall that about 4 years ago, they were in arrears, like 2 years, had 2 years executive session minutes that were 2 years old that had not been accepted. And there were some others more recent than that, but they were still pretty dated. And so the general, what should happen is what Wayne just said, that it should be reviewed at each meeting. You can accept them. You could do it all in one meeting, accept and release. But as Wayne pointed out, it's probably wiser to accept them when they're still fresh. And then each subsequent meeting thereafter, you revisit to determine whether the purpose for going into executive session still exists, or if it is passed. And if it is passed, then you need to vote to release the minutes. And at that point, they're ready to be posted if you previously accepted them.
right. So I think at this moment, we would accept and not release. That would be a motion.
I'll make a motion to accept the February 11th executive session minutes as written, not to be released.
Blondine, second.
Okay, now we can discuss them.
But only in general terms. If you have something specific, then it
Right.
should probably.
I understand. I have two issues. In the second paragraph, I mentioned, the last sentence. I don't recall that, but that could be age. That I was asked to reach out to the property member. Was that correct? If it is, I'm in.
Not to my knowledge, I believe we appointed Amanda to,
No, in February, it was Ed and I.
Yeah,
Is that not what, so we can correct that?
No, I wasn't at that meeting.
right.
no,
This is-
That might be why Ed thinks you were.
Fair
voting.
enough. Yeah,
right. And in the next paragraph, there are the letters NRT, and I think that may also be incorrect.
Okay, we'll.
That
correct it.
I think is,
I questioned that and I left it because I thought maybe I had missed something, so,
I think it's the trustees, the
yes,
reservations.
yes. Oh, I thought we corrected that, okay, yep.
With those two, those are my two corrections. Anyone else? So could we accept them with those two corrections? Do a roll call vote. Lee, aye. Amanda,
Staying.
Ed,
Aye.
Dennis,
Aye.
Carol,
Aye.
Greg,
And Jai.
and Meredith. This time I remember you.
Abstain.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're at the regular meeting minutes of the last meeting, which is the 18th.
I
Do I
make
have
a
a
motion
motion?
to accept.
Okay,
Second.
thank you. And any adjustments to these? Hearing none, I move to a vote. Lee, aye. Amanda,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Dennis,
Aye.
Carol,
Abstain.
Greg,
Aye.
Meredith,
Abstain.
thank you. And now we're at the last session's executive session, March 18th.
I'll make a motion to accept the executive session minutes of March 18th as written.
And not released.
I think there's an NRT issue in these minutes as well. I think that might be ART, both places.
And it was
Oh,
mentioned last meeting.
yes, it should be.
Excuse me, could I have a second on that? I didn't hear one.
Second.
Okay, thank you. All right. So that should be,
Yes, I caught that correction. Thank you, Amanda.
okay. Any others? Hearing none. Lee, aye. Amanda,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Dennis,
Aye.
Carol,
Abstain.
Greg,
Aye.
Meredith.
Abstain.
Thank you. Okay. So we are at the moment to move to executive session.
Okay, and just for procedural, the way we are going to do that,
Well, we have to have a voice vote first.
right, yeah.
So you want a motion? Is that what you want first?
Dennis, you've done so well this evening.
Yeah, I've had a lot of practice lately, that's why. Let me give it a go. I'll make a motion that we adjourn from, open meeting to re-adjourn an executive session, not to return to open meeting for the purpose of real estate negotiations or acquisitions, and that we allow Ms. Danielson, Mr. Bitler, and Ms. Dorenzo Howe attend.
Perfect. Well done.
Second.
All right. I'll go in the reverse order. Meredith, you want to start?
Do we have to go to another room or anything? We're good, just, oh, we have to take, I'm right. All right, I'm sorry.
Please don't interrupt the vote.
Peach, aye.
Greg,
Strange eye.
Harold,
Monday night.
Dennis,
CDI.
Ken,
Aye.
Amanda,
Aye.
and Lee, aye.